So today we're going to discuss fishing and aquaculture. There's a famous quote, if you're overfishing at the top of the food chain and acidifying the ocean at the bottom, you're creating a squeeze that could conceivably collapse the whole system, by Carl Safina. So we're going to start this unit by talking about the cod. In 1497, an explorer named John Cabot sailed from New England and landed in the island of Newfoundland in what is now Canada. In his journal, Cabot noted that the sea there is full of fish that can be taken not only with nets but with fishing baskets. Another fishing captain, written over 100 years ago, later made a similar observation. The cod are so thick by the shore that we hardly have been able to row a boat through them. So the fish, Atlantic cod, grow to be about 6 to 7 feet in length and weighing upwards of 200 pounds at full maturity. The cod, due to its massive size and ability to be salted and transported, was extremely One of the earliest forms of large-scale fishing is pole fishing, where a line is attached to a baited hook, which can catch and pull in the fish. Of all the fishing methods, pole fishing has the lowest rate of bycatch, which is when species of fish that are unwanted are accidentally caught. So here you can see a picture of pole fishing in the Maldives. So as the world population grew, so did the demand for seafood. 15% of the world uses seafood as a primary source of protein. I personally prefer fish over all other types of meat. If I could, I would absolutely be pescatarian. Other methods began to take the place of pole fishing to meet this demand, and they weren't necessarily they weren't methods that were created to decrease bycatch. So longline fishing is one form. It's a commercial fishing technique where baited hooks are attached to a single long fishing line that trails um, behind the ship. So compared to pole fishing, longline fishing has a much higher rate of bycatch. Seabirds are highly vulnerable during setting of the line. Sea turtles, sharks, and other fish are also accidentally caught. So this gold mine of fishing off of the Great Banks began to be exploited fully starting with the arrival of the fair try. So this is the first ship to be fully equipped with a trawler, a processing plant, and storage freezers. So they no longer had to catch and then hurry up to get back to shore to clean it and freeze it. They could do all that out on the ocean, so they didn't have to come in as often. So they were able to freely stay out for much longer periods of time and catch more fish, and ultimately it was more economically advantageous. So troweling is the fastest and most efficient way to catch fish. It's where a large net is dragged behind the ship, so you can imagine there's going to be a ton of bycatch because of this, but there's also going to be a lot of drag on the boat, which means there's going to be a lot more fuel consumed. If the net actually drags along the bottom of the ocean, then it's called bottom troweling. So you have regular troweling, where the net floats closer to mid-range or to the surface, and then you have bottom troweling, where it drags along. Unfortunately, troweling has the highest rates of bycatch, since any species big enough to be caught in the net will be trapped. So this is an unfortunate thing for diversity of species, and especially for any species that are endangered. So bottom troweling has the added side effect of damaging any habitat at the bottom of the seafloor, such as coral reefs. So you can see seafloor before bottom troweling, and then you can see the devastation afterwards. So this really wrecks eco. So large commercial trawlers were incredibly successful in Newfoundland, harvesting over 800,000 tons of cod in 1968, and in the following years, harvest began to decrease. Now, harvest began to decrease because ultimately they were being overharvested. So Canada evicted the fishing fleets of other countries from its waters, but despite this, the harvests continued to decline. In 1988, fishery managers called for a 50% reduction in allowable catch, and officials ended up only reducing it by 10%. So, as you can imagine, this still continued to devastate the population. So, the majority of the world's fisheries are at their maximum sustainable yield. So, this is basically the maximum that can be harvested without diminishing the population for future years. Overexploited fisheries are being harvested at unsustainable levels, and over time, these can become depleted fisheries with stocks so low that fishing cannot be supported. Ultimately, what this comes down to, folks, is that we're overpopulated and we're overfishing. So then came the cod moratorium. In 1992, a complete stoppage or moratorium to cod fishing off Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada was announced. The moratorium was devastating to the coastal towns whose economies were dependent on the fisheries. I grew up, um, my family grew up in a fishing town, and everything revolves around everything with the water. Okay, all of the boardwalk stores have restaurants where you can get fish and chips or clam chowder or some kind of fish dish, and you can watch all day long as people come in and out of the bay with their catch. And so this was extremely devastating to these small towns. It was the equivalent of shutting down the factories in the small towns of the Midwest. They were completely wrecked. So as you can imagine, fishermen were super angry. So they actually tried to forcibly interrupt the press conference, and that's what this picture shows. Is the fishermen forcibly interrupting the press conference of the Fisheries Minister John Crosbie as he announced the moratorium. So it was like complete and total uproar. So before we continue, I want to talk to you a little bit about how aquatic communities are organized. It's very much like how it's organized on land. There's different trophic levels, meaning there's a different place within the food chain. The lowest trophic level is occupied by producers, phytoplankton and algae, for example. And then we have our zooplankton occupying the second level. And then we have small fish and crustaceans and mollusks on the third level. And then medium-sized fish on the fourth level. And then we have our highest level, which contains the carnivorous fish such as the Atlantic cod. So when we talk about our marine trophic index, we're talking about a measurement of the average trophic level of the total catch from a fishery. And here you can see that catches from 1950 to around 1990 mostly contained high trophic level fish. But by the mid 1990s and onwards, there was hardly any high trophic level fish. So catches only mostly contained low trophic level fish, meaning we had wiped out that upper index. There weren't any cod. And if there were, they were hiding for their lives. So this became a huge problem because if you remember back in the 1800s, the cod were so numerous that you couldn't even row a boat through them. And now they're all but extinct. So with the loss of the cod, fishermen began pursuing herring, capelin, crabs, and other lower trophic level organisms to make up for their loss of. So this gave birth to fishing regulations. Up until the 1960s, the only regulations on fishing were territorial waters, meaning people could only um, people could only fish in certain areas or some territories didn't allow it. Exclusive fishing zones basically reached 12 miles off of each coastline. So the advent of long-range industrial fishing vessels like the Fairtry led to the creation of exclusive economic zones, which extended 200 miles from each nation's coastline. So before the advent of these crazy large fishing boats that could just mass consume fish for the population's demand, we only had a 12-mile radius that you couldn't fish on somebody else's turf. But once those boats were created, that became 200 miles. Just think about that for a second. 200 miles was the buffer zone we had to give ourselves because we were decimating populations so bad. And truly, this just comes down to we're overpopulated. Each nation has exclusive rights over all marine resources discovered within these zones. Within that 200 miles, Each nation has exclusive rights. Nobody else can fish in those waters. Nobody else can hang out in them. So many countries now establish restrictions on the amount of fish that can be harvested within their waters. There's overfishing limits, there's acceptable biological catch limits, and then there's an annual catch limit. So in the United States, annual catch limits have been established and enforced by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration since 2012. So this is fairly recently. These catch limits are lower than the maximum sustainable yield, meaning the stocks are able to recover each year. What that translates to is that we're only fishing the amount that fish can reproduce. So we're not decreasing the population anymore, we're stabilizing it. So there are some fully protected marine reserves where no living organisms can be legally harvested. These have also been established to protect areas especially high in biodiversity. So you can see those here on this map. There's Prince Edward Island's Marine Protected Area. Sorry, I'm being yawn. There's the Chagos Protected Area. There's the Mariana Trench Marine National Monument. I can't even say that word, but Marine National Monument, established by the United States. It's interesting to see how many are established by different countries. It's kind of fun. Um, we have the Phoenix Islands Protected Area, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, the Macquarie Island Commonwealth Marine Reserve, the Galapagos Marine Reserve, the Motu Motiri Hiva Marine Park, the South Orkney Marine Protected Area, and the Northeast Atlantic High Seas areas. That's it. Those are the only spots in the entire world where nobody is allowed to fish. Just those little blips. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 of them. So that leads us into the advent of aquaculture. So as the limits of wild seafood harvesting have become increasingly clear, industries are now beginning to use aquaculture, which is the process of farming aquatic organisms. So we have a graph here showing capture production of wild populations, and then we see the advent of basically fish farming coming on top of that. And it started out in the 50s, but it really became popular in the 90s and increasingly so in the 2000s and up. So the farming of saltwater organisms is called mariculture. Most mariculture operations work by taking eggs or immature fish and raising them in long rectangular nets called fish pens. So feed and other supplements are added to the top of the pen for the fish, and the wastes drop out the bottom of the pen to the seafloor. These operations are vulnerable to many of the same issues as large animal farms, including antibiotic overuse and manure, because it's still a contained operation, right? So they're going to be being grown in closer proximity, which enhances their susceptibility to. So fish farming can be combined with hydroponics to create aquaponics, which is pretty popular. I'm sure you've heard of it. We're going to go over it in some detail here. The wastewater from the fish farming is circulated through the plants, which absorb the waste as nutrients and clean the water. So I want to do a little education on consumer labels because any fish labeled as farmed was raised in a mariculture or aquaponics facility. Wild fish is just that, it's caught from a body of water. And another thing that I really want you to look for is MSC certification. This is a label attached to any seafood that follows sustainable fishing practices as established by the Marine Stewardship Council. So just like all the other consumables, there is a more sustainable way to consume this particular source of protein, and I love that they have created this label and tracking system. So we're going to start talking about some really fun stuff, starting with aquaponics and breweries. So we have craft beer hops. Sorry, I have a play on words here. This is where craft beer hops into the sustainable local food movement instead. And I figured you guys would enjoy this topic, especially because it talks about breweries. So, what is aquaponics? Again, we have fish that produce waste, where we add in microbes and worms to convert the waste to fertilizer for plants, and the plants filter water that returns then to the fish. This is the marriage of aquaculture raising fish and hydroponics, the soilless growing of plants that grows fish and plants together in one integrated system. The fish waste provides an organic food source for the growing plants, and the plants provide a natural filter for the water the fish live in. The third participants are the microbes, which are nitrifying bacteria and composting redworms that thrive in the growing media. They do the job of converting the ammonia from the fish waste first into nitrites, then into nitrates, and the solids into vermicompost that are food for the plants. Hold on, I'm going to tie this to beer, I promised. So aquaponics relieves the stress of traditional soil-based gardening and hydroponics. So in traditional soil-based gardening, we have issues with weeds, the amount of water required, soil-borne insects, digging and bending, etc., pests, knowledge required to manage soil. And in hydroponics, our issues are that we have very careful application of expensive man-made nutrients from mixing together a concoction of chemical salts and trace elements, monitoring the pH and etc. of the system, and discharge of water because of buildup of chemicals and salts that can become toxic to the plants as well as to the fish. We also have an area that's prone to disease and root rot because of all the. So this is where aquaponics comes in to save the day. Aquaponics requires feeding the fish food, food scraps, and food that you grow yourself. Once a system is established, you only need to check the pH and ammonia levels weekly, or if plants and fish seem stressed. Aquaponics never needs the water replaced. You only top it off if it evaporates. And disease is almost non-existent. So the problem with hydroponics, which is not aquaponics, remember hydroponics is just growing plants in water. Aquaponics is growing plants in water with fish. So the problem with hydroponics is that the tank water becomes polluted with fish effluent, which gives off high concentrations of ammonia. Water has to be discharged at a rate of 10 to 20% of the total volume in the tank daily. Pretty big waste of water. Again, in an aquaponic system, you never need to discharge your water, so you're not really wasting it. This water is often pumped into open streams where it pollutes and destroys waterways. And because of this unhealthy environment, fish are prone to disease and are often treated with medicines, including antibiotics. Fish disease is rare in an aquaponic system. Here's an example of a hydroponic system. So, switching back to aquaponics, which is again plants grown in water with fish. Here we have a waste high aquaponics gardening that eliminates weeds, backstrain, and small animal access to your garden because they would drown if they were in there. We get to reuse resources currently considered waste. In aquaponics, there is no more toxic runoff from either hydroponics or aquaculture. Aquaponics uses only 1/10 of the water of soil-based gardening and even less water than hydroponics or recirculating aquaculture. Watering is integral to an aquaponic system. You can't underwater or overwater. Fertilizing is also integral to an aquaponic system. You can't overfertilize or underfertilize. Gardening chores are cut down dramatically or eliminated. The aquaponics grower is able to focus on the enjoyable tasks of feeding the fish and tending and harvesting the plants. Doesn't it just sound lovely? So I'd like to say that one of the things that I have noticed that people fail at with aquaponics, aquaculture, or hydroponics is that in climates like ours, when it gets really cold, above ground tanks become very susceptible to dropping to too low of a temperature and killing the fish. So I highly recommend that people who choose any of these systems bury their tanks in the ground because the ground will actually help insulate it. So aquaponics continued. Instead of using dirt or toxic chemical solutions to grow plants, aquaponics uses highly nutritious fish effluent that contains all the required nutrients for optimal plant growth. Instead of discharging water, aquaponics uses the plants and the media in which they grow to clean and purify the water, after which it is returned to the fish tank. This water can be reused indefinitely and will only need to be replaced when it is lost to transpiration and evaporation. Two primary methods of aquaponics growing are most widely in use today. The raft-based aquaponics growing system uses a foam raft that is floating in a channel filled with fish effluent water that has been through filtration to remove solid wastes. Plants are placed in holes in the rafts and the roots dangle freely in the water. This method is most appropriate for growing salad greens and other fast-growing, relatively low-nutrient plants. So the second method is called media-based aquaponics because plants are grown in inert plant media like gravel, expanded clay pellets, core, etc. The media provides both a biological ammonia-based waste and mechanical solid waste filtration, so that requires far less maintenance than raft-based systems. Hang on one second. All of my kids are home and they're making a ton of noise, so I just need to go remind them that I'm in class. All right. So the second method is called media-based aquaponics. Um, so we have large fruiting plants that are basically grown more successfully in media-based systems than on rafts. The third method is basically a hybrid aquaponics, which is a combination of the two. The media beds become the pre-filter for the solid waste before the water enters the raft systems. One second. Have kids, they said. They'll be quiet, they said. Okay. The third method is called hybrid aquaponics, which is a combination of the two. Basically, you have media beds that become the pre-filter for the solid waste before the water enters the raft systems. And so this hybrid system style is the focus of aquabundance systems because it provides planting flexibility, high productivity, and low maintenance. So, brief history of aquaponics. Long before the term aquaponics was coined in the 1970s, the Aztec Indians actually raised plants on rafts on the surface of a lake in approximately 1000 AD. Pretty cool stuff. We're always stealing their ideas, aren't we? In modern times, aquaponics emerged from the aquaculture industry as fish farmers were exploring methods of raising fish while trying to decrease their dependence on the land, water, and other resources. So traditionally, fish were raised in large ponds or in netted pens off coastal lines. For the past 35 years, much progress has been made in recirculating aquaculture systems called RAS. The advantage of RAS is that fish can be stocked much more densely, up to a pound of fish per gallon of water, thus using only a fraction of the water and space to grow the same amount of fish as pond or netting based systems. The disadvantage is the large amount of wastewater that quickly accumulates. So in the 1970s, research on using plants as a natural filter began, most notably by Dr. Rames Rocosi at the University of the Virgin Islands. And the first large-scale commercial aquaponics facility, BioShelters in Amherst, Massachusetts, was established in the mid-1980s. It's actually still in operation today, which is pretty amazing. Home-based aquaponics owes its origin in the early 1990s to Tom and Paula Spiragno of S&S Aquafarms in West Plains, Montana. The Spiragnos diligently refined a media bed growing technique that was more appropriate for smaller systems and wrote a how-to manual that became a springboard for many home-based systems. So on the other side of the world, at this same time, Australia's interest in home aquaponics was taking off because it was a way for them to solve their drought and poor soil conditions. So Joel Malcolm basically started a popular form of backyard aquaponics, and it was literally an online forum. And they were creating and selling aquaponic systems designed for homeowners. They joined Murray Hallam of Practical Aquaponics, who also ran a forum and is best known for some entertaining DVDs on home aquaponics. So in 2010, the aquaponic gardening community was formed, and it has since become the largest online gathering place for aquapons, which is literally a term that they call themselves, in North America. So if you want to become an aquapon, this is where you can get started. In September 2011, the book Aquaponic Gardening by Sylvia Bernstein was introduced at the very first annual Aquaponics Association conference in Orlando, Florida. Perfect place to have it if you ask me. It was the first time that a complete guide to designing, building, starting, and maintaining a media-based system had been available. So within a month, the book was a best-selling gardening book on Amazon.com, and within the first year, the book was printed 4 times and sold over 30,000 copies. So to say that this was becoming a movement is an understatement. It was becoming very popular with backyard and aquaponics system. So at that very same conference, the Aquaponics Association was officially created, with Gina Caviero of Green Acre Aquaponics and Sylvia Bernstein of the Aquaponics Source as the founders and inaugural chair and vice chair. The association's mission is to promote aquaponics and continue holding annual conferences so aquaponics practitioners from around the world can gather once a year to exchange ideas and learn from each other. So there's also basically a school for aquaponic gardeners created in Colorado. Um, and commercial farming started to really become a focus in 2014. This leads us to beer. That was a lot of history to get to beer, but now I'm sure you're ready. Food chain Lex. This was Kentucky's first indoors aquaponics farm, started in an abandoned bread factory in 2013. What's so amazing about this place, you guys and gals, folks, is that Food Chain Lex basically took this abandoned factory in a really rundown neighborhood that was basically falling apart because it was it was a shut down industrial complex. And we all know what happens when we shut down industrial complexes. The areas around them start to die and degrade in value, and houses go down in value. So they took this bread factory and they cleaned it up and they created an indoor aquaponics farm. It was a wonderful way to demonstrate how cities can turn underutilized industrial space into food production. And aquaponics was such an amazingly creative approach to sustainable agriculture, where they took aquaculture, the farming of fish, and hydroponics, the growing of plants without soil, and combined to make this efficient system. So this is what it looks like. Um, but they expanded above and beyond this. So here you can see that they have their hops, their grains, and several types of vegetables growing in an inner city environment. And they also have beds of fish being grown. And it's one big, beautiful system. Now, granted, this system is going to require electricity, and that is the unfortunate, maybe less than sustainable side of this. However, what has happened to this area is one of the most incredible I've ever seen. So first we'll start with how they set it up. They have a deep water recirculating system with 7,000 gallons of water, 500 tilapia, and thousands of plants. The fish waste ammonia is converted to plant food by helpful bacteria, nitrification, and this way the fish get clean water that is filtered by the plants without using super delicious plants. So this recirculating water system uses 90% less water than traditional agriculture. And they use symbiotic partnerships to make urban agriculture work. So they have their own craft brewery that stems from the grains that they grow with the fish. They have a seafood restaurant next to the craft brewery that stems from the tilapia that they grow. They have a nonprofit incubation hub where they help local small businesses thrive and provide mentorship. They have a bike co-op. Like there's literally like all these organized um, bicycle and beer runs that are associated with it, and it's become this huge cultural thing. They have an art studio to feed the artistic mind. They even have coffee grown and roasted on site. They have a roller derby league that uses half of the building for giant tournaments. and they have a bourbon distillery all in one giant factory using aquaculture. It's just the most incredible urban agriculture thing I've ever seen. And since it started, what has happened is there's been an influx of people to the area, and now there's about 20 or 30 businesses that have popped up around the factory, and the homes in that neighborhood have tripled in value. So you took an old abandoned factory in a neighborhood that was falling apart. We're talking roofs caving in, porches falling off. It was lower income and it was rough. And now it's one of the most expensive high-end neighborhoods to live in. What a turnaround urban agriculture can make. Imagine if we were able to do something like this with some of the old abandoned factories in Muncie. I dream of this. So our strongest link for Lex, food chain Lex, is to Smithtown Seafood, where they created a relationship with Chef Mitchell's family of restaurants. They directly sell their tilapia, lettuce, leafy greens, herbs, and microgreens to them. So they provide fresh fish and greens in Lexington, Kentucky, and it allows them to demonstrate the benefit of mutualistic partnerships between farmers and restaurants while creating market avenues for aquaponic produce. Just genius. Food Chain was also able to repurpose the spent grains, which is a byproduct of the brewing process from West Six Brewery. You've probably heard of West Six. They're pretty popular. These grains, which are a major waste product of brewing, are then used to feed the fish. So not only do the fish provide the waste to grow the grains, but then they consume them. You want to talk about no waste? It's just phenomenal. Ultimately decreases their reliance on commercial fish feeds and makes the business more profitable. So I'm gonna post this link because um, so I'm providing you with some links on how to build systems, um, along with spreadsheets for microgreens information. I'm not going to open these, but they are available for. And I want to talk to you about some amazing companies that have popped up in Chicago. There are several companies and volunteers in Chicago that are turning that I've actually finished this, but they turned a former meatpacking plant into a vertical urban farm, and they combined aquaponics with kombucha tea production, beer brewing, biogas energy, and a kitchen that serves up um, net zero waste food. Pretty incredible stuff. So there's their YouTube link. So in Chicago, the building, which was purchased in 2010, underwent a whole bunch of renovations, and they've opened 5 tenant spaces ready to be leased. The building was fully functional in 2016 and created 125 jobs in the neighborhood, diverting more than 10,000 tons of food waste from landfills each year. Pretty incredible. I think the opportunity for urban gardening and vertical indoor gardening is I know there's several countries in Northern Europe who use this as their primary means of growing their produce due to their lack of a growing season because of their cold climate, and it's pretty powerful. So, with that all being said, I wanted to show you some backyard aquaponics operations. So, if you were ever interested in doing this, there's ways that you can create it yourself. And there's a link provided on here where I found this